questions for the record subject to the length limitations in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address to the previous mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulation, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum present. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing today entitled Woman Leading the Way, the Democratic Movement in Belarus. I'll begin my statement. In the days leading up to August 2020 and the presidential election that day in Belarus, one after another, the presidential candidates who opposed Alexander Lukashenko were jailed or forced out of the country. The election then took place without international observers, under the control of state-owned media, and in an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. In the actual election day, Svetlana Sigonoskaya stepped in for her husband, Sergei Sikhanovsky, a political activist and blogger who was jailed just a few weeks before. During the election process, independent sources found that Svetlana Sigonoskaya received more votes than the incumbent Lukashenko, and when the election results came in, it was clear to Belarusians and the international community at large that the election had taken place in fraudulent conditions and that Lukashenko could not claim victory. Yet Lukashenko claimed himself to be president, underestimating the will of the Belarusian people and the strength of Svetlana Sigonoskaya. After 26 years of dictatorial rule, the Belarusian people had had enough. They gathered in the streets en masse and peacefully demonstrated against the Lukashenko regime and for their right to a new, free, and fair election. They organized themselves through new means of technology, sharing information over applications like Telegram. And what's so striking for many of us in the US was that they were led by a coalition of women who called for solidarity with Svetlana Sigonoskaya. Unfortunately, these peaceful demonstrations were met with state-sponsored violence that was organized and mandated by the highest levels of government. Security forces began to beat and detain hundreds of peaceful demonstrators, crack down on independent journalists, and intimidate opposition leaders. The Lukashenko regime took Svetlana Sigonoskaya into a government building, directly threatened her and her family, and thus forced her into exile in Lithuania. Later, activists like Maria Kalesnikova were kidnapped, and attempts were made to force them out of the country as well. And finally, journalists like Katrina Andreeva and Dara Sholtsova were arrested and jailed for simply filming peaceful demonstrations. Authorities have arbitrarily detained and physically, sexually, and emotionally assaulted tens of thousands of peaceful protesters, journalists, and civil society members. Today, hundreds remain in detention, and many have recounted experiencing torture, sexual violence and rape, beatings, and other ill treatment. At least 8 protesters have been killed. And today, the Belarusian people mark 221 days of resistance against brutal authoritarian oppression. It's been over 7 months in a fight to establish a rule of law and achieve a democratic future for their country. We in Congress must stand with the people of Belarus as they push for democracy. We must recognize the sacrifices made daily by peaceful protesters who take the streets knowing full well that they'll face harassment, intimidation, unlawful detention, or worse. And we must salute the courage of the women of Belarus who, in a highly patriarchal society, have shown strength, determination, and leadership, standing at the center of organizations like Coordination Council in an attempt to establish a dialogue with the Lukashenko regime and initiate new, free, and fair elections. Our expert witness today knows all too well the challenges posed by autocratic regimes who benefit from corruption and whose close friends and allies only support repressive tactics. Yet the continuous fight for democracy around the world is real and can take different forms. We've watched some countries, such as those in Central Europe, who've fallen into the trap that is democratic backsliding and illiberalism. We've watched as authoritarian states have used the pandemic to gather even greater control over their citizens, such as the recent arrest of almost 200 opposition leaders in Moscow. And we here in Washington have had to confront the fragile nature of our own democracy, as just months ago, violent armed insurrectionists stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to halt the democratic process for a free and fair election. In times marked by challenges to democracy at home and abroad, one democracy must lend its hand to another. Help from democratic allies across borders and oceans can ensure that societies seeking to establish democracy, often in the face of anti-democratic threats, can prevail. A network of support and the ability to communicate with that network is a necessary component to democratic strength. That's why we, the transatlantic community and the United States Congress, must stand in unity and support the democratic movement in Belarus and all those who fight to establish or protect their democracy abroad. That's why last September, I held a hearing before the subcommittee on the democratic awakening in Belarus. That hearing included firsthand accounts of images of violence inflicted upon the Belarusian people by security forces. We've introduced resolutions condemning the human rights abuses by Lukashenko and praising the bravery of the Belarusian citizens. We've also passed the revised version of the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights, and Sovereignty Act, authored by Representative Chris Smith, which expanded the robust set of sanctions and authorities related to Belarus at the president's disposal. Yet while we've taken these steps forward, it's the peaceful protesters on the ground in Belarus and the Belarusian diaspora around the world, from Vilnius to Cape Cod, that continues to drive movements and democracy forward and to keep this fight for democracy in Belarus alive. With that being said, I'm pleased to welcome the woman who has become the leader of the democratic movement in Belarus, Svetlana Sigonoskaya, as our expert witness today. She didn't plan to run for president. However, as she said, she's shown up for her people because her people showed up for her. Her steadfast courage, dedication, and tenacity is remarkable, and I look forward to our discussion. I now turn to the ranking member for his remarks. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Keating. And today we gather to recognize the bravery of our witness, Svetlana Sigonoskaya, and her inspiring campaign to promote democratic aspirations of the people of Belarus. You and the historic peaceful protesters have stared down overwhelming odds and lit a fire to a renewed democrat spirit in Belarus. And this movement is now shining a light on the authoritarian shadow that has covered the citizens of Belarus during Alexander Lukashenko's rule. I'd also like to acknowledge the Coordination Council, its members, and all of the Belarusian citizens engaging in the noble pursuit of a free and democratic society. And it's worth noting, as we recognize International Women's Month, that exceptionally brave and daring women are leading this democratic revolution in Belarus. This Sigonoskaya and thousands of women like her have proven to their country and the rest of the world that the future is in their able hands. These freedom fighters are not seeking unreasonable terms. They seek legal due process, they seek freedom of expression and information, and they seek freedom from the harassment of an oppressive state, and they seek freedom to chart their own future. Following the August 9th election, the people of Belarus wanted their voices heard in response to the dictatorial actions of Lukashenko. In response to these citizens' peaceful protests, Lukashenko's security forces responded with excessive force, the use of chemical riot dispersion methods and measures, and detained citizens completely without cause. Plainclothes police officers have engaged in increasingly aggressive and violent crackdowns of those who are peacefully protesting the election results and its resulting movement. International monitors estimate that more than 32,000 Belarusians have been temporarily detained and imprisoned for nearly 300 political prisoners remain behind bars as of this hearing this morning. According to a report by the European Parliament, last year, at least 10 demonstrators have been killed by government forces or died while in custody under suspicious circumstances. A harrowing account of our witness described the situation of jail protesters that, quote, have been rounded up and housed like cattle in tiny overcrowded jail cells without access to water, sanitation, or any normal sleeping positions. Going on to say that torture is now commonplace. Lukashenko has smothered free speech in Belarus and manipulated the media to suppress the surge in his opposition to conceal the violent tactics of his oppression. Russian propagandists were flown in to work for state-run TV in Belarus. Meanwhile, independent journalists have faced intimidation and imprisonment. Vocal critics of the regime faced trumped-up charges and are imprisoned for speaking truth to power. And as illegitimate regime in Belarus continues to normalize a litany of human rights violations, the calls for Mr. Lukashenko's for him to step down and recognize a new free and fair system of elections is gaining momentum worldwide. A group in my home state of Pennsylvania even organized a rally in Pittsburgh on a snow-covered day this year to raise awareness of the plight of their loved ones. And as such, the United States, in coordination with its European allies and partners, must be vigilant and robust in our support for Belarus and their civil society and those who are persecuted by the Lukashenko regime. In line with the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights and Sovereignty Act of 2020, which I co-sponsored, we must continue to demand the end of Lukashenko's violence, the release of all those wrongfully detained, and continue harsh sanctions for those complicit in these human rights violations. The illegitimate Lukashenko regime must once and for all step down and allow for free and fair elections to be held. The people of Belarus are demanding the right to chart their own future, and their voices deserve to be heard. I yield back.
I'd like to thank the ranking member, and without objection, I'd like to recognize Representative Smith, who's the author of the Belarus Democracy Act, for a brief statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much for inviting me to allowing me to be part of your panel, and to Brian Fitzpatrick as well as to you for the great work that you gentlemen are doing, and the subcommittee. Your resolution that is pending, I think, will again reiterate the bipartisan, bicameral support of Congress behind Sigonoskaya and the rest of the human rights activists and defenders in Belarus. The leadership that you have shown and that the people of Belarus have shown, despite incredible odds, despite the fact that the bullies are out there beating, arresting, torturing, and even killing the best and the bravest and the brightest of Belarus. The picture, Mr. Chairman, that you have painted, as well as the ranking member, is both bleak and hopeful. Bleak because Lukashenko is still in charge, but hopeful because the people of Belarus have you to champion their dreams, and that goes for this leadership led by women who are in exile, some of whom are in exile, others sadly are in prison. You know, my work on Belarus goes back to really the 1990s, and in 2004 I authored the Belarus Democracy Act, which really has become the template for Magnitsky, holding men and women in the Lukashenko regime both in terms of visa denial and making them unable to participate in any kind of economic relationship with the U.S. and U.S. banks. I did it again in 06, 11, and as you pointed out, the 2020 Act reiterates and expands and puts an emphasis on sovereignty, because we know that the Russians are eyeing Belarus in a way that is reminiscent of what they did with the Crimea and other parts of the Ukraine. Again, according to the representative of the OSCE, the Belarusian authorities have filed at least 141 politically motivated cases against women. 49 are currently in detention or under house arrest. Another 75 are suspects in politically motivated criminal cases, and thousands of other women have fled Belarus in fear for their safety. Despite all of this, the image of Belarusian women in white has become iconic, representing the hopes of all Belarusians for a better future. Again, thank you for this timely hearing. And again, it gives us all an opportunity to say, We are in solidarity with these incredibly brave women and men. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Smith, and thank you for your longstanding work on this important issue.
Well, thank you.
I'll now introduce our witness. Ms. Svetlana Sigonoskaya is a central leader of the democratic movement in Belarus and a human rights activist who challenged Alexander Lukashenko at the 2020 presidential election. This Belarusian election was fraught with widespread fraud and followed by unjustifiable violence. In the months following, Sigonoskaya has been a symbolic leader of the Belarusian protests and has contributed greatly to promoting and organizing positive change in Belarus, both through her domestic and international engagement. The European Parliament recognized the fight of Belarusian people for democracy and freedom, led by Sigonoskaya, by awarding her, among other leaders, the prestigious annual Sakharov Prize. She's also received a series of international awards for her courageous struggle against the authoritarian regime of Lukashenko. I'll now recognize and state my pleasure at joining us, Ms. Sigonoskaya, for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made a part of the record. Ms. Sigonoskaya, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, everyone. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, Honorable Representative Smith, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. First of all, I would like to extend my St. Patrick's Day greetings to all of you. Mr. Keating, as you may know, for me, Ireland has a very special place in my heart. Mr. Smith, thank you for being here with us today. We deeply appreciate your tremendous support for Belarus throughout 2 decades, including all 4 Belarus Democracy Acts that you introduced and helped enact. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit pictures for the record.
Without objection, we can display those pictures as you begin your testimony.
Thank you. So, I'm deeply grateful for the great honor of addressing you on behalf of the Belarusian people. I'm here to give voice to the thousands of Belarusians who face injustice, intimidation, and brutality, and who still continue to protest daily. It has been more than 7 months since Belarusians began the United Peaceful Protest Movement, which was met with unprecedented violence from the authorities. Over 32,000 people have been detained. More than 2,500 criminal cases have been initiated. Over 1,000 cases of torture have been documented by human rights NGOs. And there are 290 political prisoners at the moment. At least 8 protesters were killed. Not a single government official has been held accountable for the brutality, repression, torture, and murder. Amidst the injustice, the brave women of Belarus became a symbol of hope and resilience for our country. 73-year-old Nina Baginskaya has been protesting against the regime since the 1990s, despite the detentions by police and raids on her house. Miss Belarus 2008 Volga Khizhenkova and basketball star Elena Levchenko spent 42 days and 15 days respectively in detention in unsanitary and humiliation conditions for peacefully protesting. Women wearing white dresses and carrying flowers formed the first human chains as a shield for male protesters. Their desire to protect was stronger than their fear of being detained and tortured. Yet, they could not protect everyone. On 10th August, Alexander Raikovsky fell the first victim of police brutality. He was shot point blank by a police squad in Minsk. 2 female journalists, Daria Chiltsova and Katerina Andreeva, were sentenced to 2 years in prison for doing their job, live streaming a vigil for the peaceful protester Roman Bondarenko, who was murdered by the regime cronies in his own backyard for protecting our national symbols. Those stories illustrate that we are dealing with a human rights crisis of unprecedented proportions for Belarus that keeps worsening day by day. But the people still persist. Our workers united in strike committees. Our doctors and professors stood up for their colleagues who were fired for their political views. Our professional athletes raised awareness all over the world. Principal police officers and investigators resigned. Neighborhood communities have become the place of growth for a grassroots movement. Yet, all of this is not enough. Lukashenko still has the resources to retain power. So, the United States should insist on stopping the violence, releasing the political prisoners, restoring the rule of law, and launching a genuine dialogue between the legitimate representatives of Belarusians and the regime. At the same time, it's not words, but actions that matter. We call on the US to impose sanctions against state-owned enterprises, the judiciary, and oligarchs. Sanctions are one of the most effective measures. We call on the US to use its diplomacy to isolate Lukashenko by curbing international agreements and commerce between the Lukashenko regime and other countries. We call on the US to help with international mediation through the OSCE. We call on the United States Congress to consider increasing the support for the pressing needs of Belarusians. People of Belarus require support, especially the civil society, the human rights defenders, the independent media, and the businesses. All of them have been repressed by the regime. As the European Union has drafted a comprehensive plan to support Belarus during the transition and after free and fair elections, we call on the US Congress to join this work in order to start developing a joint Marshall Plan for Belarus. I'm bound by the will of the majority of Belarusians to make this happen, and I call on the United States of America to join me on this mission. My nation is facing humanitarian crisis. People are suffering and dying right now. Belarusians need you as never before. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very moving and very important testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each and pursuant to House rules. All time yielded is for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of the hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. And if you missed your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphones and address the chair verbally. I would just ask, is Representative Series still with us? I know he had to leave. I was going to yield my time to him. Evidently, he's had to leave. So I'll start by recognizing myself. The role of women in the movement for a democratic and free Belarus is really the theme of what we're talking about in terms of the democratic movement that's there. And this is unique in that respect, and it's effective and it's important, and it's really captured the attention of the world. And I'd just like to ask you what specifically you've seen as the role of women in spearheading this effort for free and democratic, elections and a democracy in Belarus. What can you tell us in more detail about that specific role of women?
Actually, the women played a huge role in this revolution. And first of all, the fact that 3 women led this pre-election campaign inspired all other Belarusian women for fight. We 3 women were put on this position instead of our men. And it was really regime's mistake that they underestimated women of Belarus. our ex-president always told that our constitution is not for women, that women will never be able to lead the country. But we managed, because women, especially Belarusian women, are really strong. And when our women were put in such circumstances, when they had to show how strong they are, they showed the most bravery that the whole world was inspired of. And after 3 days of hell the regime made in Belarus after election day, and thousands of men have been detained and tortured in jails, our women had to stand in front of our men, just hiding men behind of them to protect them. So our wonderful, peaceful women showed to the whole world that we are brave and we manage everything only because we want better future for our children, and we are ready to defend not only our children but our men as well.
Yeah. I think you've changed, this effort has changed the dynamics, gender dynamics in the country as well. It goes far beyond this movement itself. Now, you've recently released the liberation plan of yours. Can you highlight the most important aspects of that and how the U.S. can be useful in seeing that plan come to life?
From the beginning of this revolution, after the election and before election, we told that we need new elections because the previous elections were falsified, and just to step out of this political and humanitarian crisis in Belarus, we need new elections. But we need these new elections through peaceful dialogue with the regime. But we see that regime doesn't respond to our calls for negotiations. And that's why we systematically, continuously put in pressure on regime and his cronies. Inside the country, these are protesting movements, demonstrations, different initiatives. People are not giving up. And despite of this tremendous level of violence from the regime, people are continuing to fight. But of course, we need international support as well. We need international pressure, because democratic countries can't close their eyes on what's going on in Belarus. And they have to stand for the values of the democratic countries, for human rights, for dignity. And it's, you know, the situation in Belarus, it's a challenge not only for Belarusians, it's a challenge for European countries, for the USA, for Canada, just to prove that their values are not just words, that they have to stand for this. And we are a wonderful country, and we are on our own path for democracy. So we call you we call on you, stand with us in this difficult time and do your best for one more nation, proud nation, become a democratic country.
Well, thank you. And I also want to thank you for meeting with Ambassador Julie. I spoke with her just the other day, and we're looking forward to her being recognized too by Belarus. I now yield to our ranking member, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin by asking you, sir, to please enter into the record a letter from the Free Belarus Coalition for Bipartisan and Bicameral Support requesting $30 million for fiscal year 2022 funding to support Belarusian civil society and the organic democratic movement. And I'm holding up the letter.
That will be, per our instructions in the beginning, put on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is in line with the bipartisan 2020 Belarus Democracy Act, which calls to increase foreign assistance. Ms. Sigonoskaya, thank you so much for being here with us today. We greatly admire and respect your courage. More than you know, you are a beacon of courage, not just for us on this committee, but for the Congress and for the world. And ma'am, if you could just state for the record, in furtherance of this request for $30 million, how will the Belarusian assistance be best spent by Belarusian civil society and on pro-democratic initiatives?
First of all, I have to say that your help is extremely essential in our case. But I have to admit that we need rapid help because people are suffering now at this very moment in jails and on the ground. And so through Belarus Democracy Act, Congress can increase and appropriate more funding to organizations working in Belarus. For example, just to traditional and emerging civil society, like traditional, we need help to NGOs like Defending Center Vesna, to media and to activists, and to emerging civil society like Telegram channels, YouTube bloggers, athletes, doctors, and you also can increase budgets for Belarus of American organizations such as USAID, for example, but again, I have to repeat that this is urgent help, just to keep civil society resistance. We need to help them now.
Thank you, Svetlana, and to all of my colleagues on the committee, I urge strong bipartisan support for this funding request. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'd like to thank the ranking member, and the chair now recognize Vice Chair of the committee, Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us here today, Ms. Sigonoskaya. You've demonstrated immense bravery and selflessness over the past year and a true commitment to the people and the future of Belarus. Thank you, and I know that those standing up for democratic principles and human rights around the world appreciate your tremendous work and certainly your willingness to be a witness here today. After your husband's candidacy for the election in August was denied, you took on the role and ran against Lukashenko. How has your own vision of your future and leadership evolved since August? And frankly, did you ever see yourself taking on such a prominent role?
Thank you. I became in this pre-election campaign a symbol of resistance, a symbol of unity. But as a matter of fact, life put me in such circumstances that I had to take this responsibility and become a leader of this revolution. And I know that Belarusian people know whom they voted for. And I feel huge support from Belarusian people. It is rather difficult way. I always put in difficult circumstances. I feel huge pressure from propaganda. And I know that all the Belarusian people are feeling tremendous pressure on the ground. But knowing that I'm doing this for the future of all Belarusian people, for my children, for all those who are suffering in jails now. So I have to find strength every day of this fight, and I'm finding this strength in Belarusian people. I know that they are fighting, and they are not giving up. So I have no right to give up as well. It is difficult, but I'm a woman and I will manage everything.
Isn't that so true? Well, I'm curious then, how has your forced exile affected your ability to interact with the democratic movement back home in Belarus? And how has it impacted your ability to communicate and advocate and certainly lead this continued movement?
It was usual regime's practice to make the people flee from the country for them to stop struggling. The same happened to me. I was sent out of the country, and I was supposed to stop, but I couldn't. I couldn't betray Belarusian people. And you know, propaganda always say, oh, she lost this connection with Belarus, she's in exile, she doesn't understand everything, but it's not true. And thanks to internet, every day I have Zoom conferences and Zoom meeting with all the groups in Belarus. I have meetings with doctors, with students, workers, striking committees, neighborhoods. Every day I have to feel people. I have to look into their eyes. I have to inspire them, and they inspire me back. So for sure, I'm not losing this connection. I feel that like I'm there on the ground through this connection. But of course, knowing that I will be jailed as soon as I pass the border, I'm sure that here, even if in exile, I can do much, much more for Belarusian people for the sake of my country. So I have to stay here and struggle together with Belarusian people.
Well, I want to thank you so much for bringing your answers to this committee, certainly your experiences. Thank you for your continued work on behalf of the Belarusian people and on behalf of democratic ideals and values. It's amazing to see leaders like you who are fighting for the rights of the people they should be representing and that they want to stand up for. So thank you again for coming before this committee. Thank you for telling us as a committee what we could be doing to support. And I think you've heard so far that you have many American members of Congress who are paying close attention to your ongoing struggles and the struggles of your people. So thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks. Vice Chairman, it's my understanding that Representative Wagner has yielded her time to Representative Smith, so the chair calls on Representative Smith for his questions.
Thank you very much, and Ann, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for this important hearing, so we can reassert, recalibrate, and do even more to help the democratic opposition in Belarus. And Svetlana certainly is epitomizes grace under pressure, courage under pressure, and we are all inspired, I think, beyond words, to do more to assist. You, in your recent appeal to the United Nations, the EU, and the United States, Svetlana, asked that political prisoners, and trying to support political prisoners, that we sanction prison chiefs, judges, prosecutors, prison guards. And I'm wondering, if is it your sense that we're doing enough to try to impose those sanctions? Obviously, getting the names of those individuals is extremely important, and the more we have that, the more we can try to hold them to account. You've also noted the gross mistreatment of the female prisoners, including threatening to take their children away, humiliation of all kinds, beatings, all kinds of assault, humiliation. That needs to be, if you could perhaps elaborate on some of that, because it is outrageous. I've met with Lukashenko twice. He is a bully. We all know that. I think he's an egomaniac. We all know that. But for those who are behind bars, we've got to find the most effective strategies to intervene and to do it immediately. And just bottom line, do you think we're all doing enough? The European Union, the United States, the UN, and be blunt. Everyone means well. We all mean well. This is totally bipartisan. And again, the chairman, I think, is doing a great job. His resolution will again give us an opportunity to speak out with one voice when that comes up on the floor of the House. But please don't worry about being diplomatic. We got to know, are we doing enough? Svetlana?
Yes, I'm here. I have to say that I'm really grateful for all the actions that Europe and America and Canada have done already, because you stand for us in very, in crucial moment of our revolution. Just after the elections, no one country recognized Lukashenko as legitimate. Everybody told that elections were fraudulent, Lukashenko is illegitimate, and just I ask you at the moment to be consistent in your vision. And I understand that you had done a lot, and you impose sanctions on individual sanctions. But you know what is going on in Belarus? It's my personal and Belarusians' pain, and of course, we just to stop this level of violence, just to start negotiations, to start dialogue, we need more pressure on Lukashenko's regime. And in this way, I suppose that sanctions are the most powerful leverage to make this regime to respond to our calls for dialogue. And now we need to widen this list of individual sanctions. These sanctions should be imposed on security forces officers, judges, educational and sport officials who support regime, who in this or that extent were involved in atrocities and humiliation and violence in Belarus. And also Congress should also legislate for wider sectoral sanctions, such as in the oil and gas and potash fertilizers industries, just to strike at the regime's most important benefactors and primary sources of resilience. So we have to put sanctions on those like wallets of Lukashenko that support regime, and support regime means supporting violence and tortures in Belarus. So I'm sure that you can do more and more, and until this violence stops, we have to put greater pressure on the regime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Chair now is Representative Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the delay in getting my mute off. I appreciate it. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready to go. I'm sorry about that. First of all, I just want to start by echoing comments made by my colleagues in recognizing your courageous efforts to build a democratic future in Belarus. Your leadership is inspiring, and my question is about the role of U.S. diplomacy. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the role that might be played by newly appointed Ambassador Julie Fisher in promoting democracy and supporting the democratic aspirations of the people of Belarus. And as she engages with a regime that does not have popular legitimacy, what message would you like our ambassador to convey?
Thank you. As a matter of fact, I met with Julia Fisher. We had a wonderful conversation, and I saw such a huge empathy for Belarusian people from her, and I understood that she would be the greatest diplomat on the ground ever. And of course, we welcome presence of Julia Fisher on the ground for her to monitor the situation in Belarus. She can visit jails just to see conditions of keeping women and men in jails. They are unhuman, I have to say. She can visit trials, you know, to see that there is no law in Belarus. She can support civil society in different ways. But very important moment, Julia Fisher hasn't give credentials to Lukashenko. He is not legitimate president, and he can't be considered as a person whom credentials can be given to. So I'm sure it can be done. You know, I mean, she can stay there as diplomat without doing this doing this action.
Thank you. And I have a little bit more time, so I also wanted to ask you, you have called on the pro-democracy movement to hold demonstrations on March 25th, on Freedom Day, marking Belarus' Declaration of Independence in 1918. What I'd like to know is what can we as members of the US Congress and others who stand in solidarity with pro-democracy forces do that might be helpful to put pressure on the regime ahead of that day or on that day?
On the 25th of March, it's our Independence Day in Belarus, and people went out for demonstrations every year. And for sure, this year will not be exclusion. And moreover, people demand this day will be the beginning of the new wave of demonstrations in Belarus, new wave of protest and movement. And people really have this inner demand to show them that we are here. We are people that have our rights for, to vote, to say everything. And of course, people will go for the rallies, and people are continuing putting pressure by different initiatives. And just to support these people, the whole world have to show solidarity with them, to be vocal about them, to put these facts on media that, look, Belarusian people are fighting, they're still there, and we have to help them. Just put our question of Belarus on the agenda. Be with us with any different ways. Talk about us in social media, in social networks. Put us on the agenda, and we will see this. Because international support is extremely important in our case. We have to know that the whole world is watching us, that we are not alone.
Thank you so much. We will do our best to support you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Weil. Representative Wagner is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing. I'm proud to stand with the Belarusian democratic movement as it demands greater freedom and respect for fundamental rights from the authoritarian Lukashenko regime. I want to thank our witness, Ms. Sigonoskaya, for her courage and tireless work for the people of Belarus. Mrs. Sigonoskaya, you wrote last year that access to information is the strongest weapon the opposition has, and I could not agree more. Truth is the potent threat to authoritarianism, and shedding light on the abuses perpetrated by the Lukashenko regime advances democracy and liberty for Belarusians. What more can the United States do to support independent media in Belarus and amplify voices that continue to exercise their rights to dissent and free speech?
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. Media is extremely important in our case because only through media we can know what's going on in Belarus. You know that this regime has pressed almost all the independent media in Belarus. They can't work. Regime didn't accredit international media. They didn't allow international media to come to Belarus because he had a lot to hide. He had to hide his crimes, violence and atrocities. And still just to media survive in Belarus, they really need great support. And first of all, you can, at the moment, you can support different YouTubers that are on the ground and out of the country, show us the real situation in Belarus. You have to call to free imprisoned journalists who just have been detained for doing their job. And you can support Telegram channels that also show the real picture of the ground. And you can support Radio Free Europe on the ground. So that a lot can be done, really. And thank you for what you are doing already.
Thank you. In the coming months, how will Opposition's Coordination Council work to sustain the pro-democracy movement in Belarus? How is the Lukashenko government obstructing the council's mission, and how can the United States best pressure Lukashenko to end political persecution of council members specifically?
Coordination Council was created as a platform for negotiations, and they are building structures inside the country, different working groups that are working with students, with striking committees, with neighborhoods and all that stuff. And this new form of social groups, grassroots social groups, are extremely important. It's like democratic, new building of democratic organizations. We have never had democracy. It's a pity in our country. It's like grassroots democracy. And every country can support these organizations, these grassroots organizations, like teaching them how to build this democracy, how to be involved in in this political competitions, I'd say. And we have to study everything. We have to study everything from the beginning, and you can assist us in this.
Thank you very much. I understand that the Kremlin sent Russian propagandists to work at Belarusian state TV in support of the Lukashenko regime. Are these propagandists still actively working in Belarus, and are there efforts to shape the information domain in Belarus in Lukashenko's favor? Is it working?
After that level of atrocities and violence after election day, most of journalists were fired from state TV, but they very soon were replaced by Russian journalists. And Russian journalists didn't feel that pain that Belarusian journalists felt, and they, of course, they could use this propaganda very widely to show me in a bad way, I'd say. And but now I know that these Russian journalists, they already went back to Russia, but still propaganda in Belarus is working very hard. They want to discredit me. They want to show that opposition is splitted, but it isn't so. And they put a lot of efforts to show that opposition died. And every day we show to the whole world that we are still here, that we are fighting. So we are fighting with propaganda as well. They can't do anything when opposition is united. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sigonoskaya. We are grateful for your courage, and I have expired my time. Gratefully, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to really extend a deep debt of gratitude to you for holding this hearing today. There are a lot of things that our committee does, and they're all important. But what we're doing today in this hearing, and the message that we're sending to Lukashenko, the message that we're sending to the people of Belarus, the message that we're sending to the Kremlin and to the world, that we are committed to helping to foster democracy, to standing on the side of those who want the ability to live in a democracy. that's as important as anything we'll do. And Ms. Sigonoskaya, there's no one who's done more in Belarus to help accomplish that than you. And I want to thank you for appearing before the committee. I want to thank you for your powerful testimony. We see in the work we do here the constant relentless threat that authoritarianism poses to democracies and to democratic values. And Belarus and the United States may not be neighbors, but the struggle in Belarus today is a generational challenge that we cannot afford to look away from. We have to lead. And as my colleagues have made clear, the United States Congress stands with the people of Belarus, and we support you as you work to withstand Russian aggression, create a freer, more democratic nation. So that the battle lines of the fight to protect democratic values and human rights transcend state boundaries and peoples. It's imperative that those who stand for democracy everywhere, including here in the United States, recognize one another as partners in this struggle. And not only am I an American invested in protecting my own country's democracy, I am also Ms. Sigonoskaya, the proud grandson of immigrants from 2 small towns in Belarus. And I thank you for your testimony today, and I thank you for your courage and for your determination. I want to ask you, we've spoken a lot, you've spoken powerfully about the pressure that Lukashenko must feel. Recently, Lukashenko talked about enacting constitutional reforms at a referendum next year and organizing new presidential elections sometime thereafter. How do you interpret these actions, and what can we do to not fall prey to efforts to shield Lukashenko and others responsible for the jailings, the attacks on journalists and activists from our actions now? What do we do here with this?
You know, I have to say that when regime is weak, it starts to talk about a new constitution and referendum and all this stuff. We are talking about new elections. We are talking about dialogue between society, civil society, and regime. We need amending of constitution, but it's not the question now. The question now is solving a political and humanitarian crisis in Belarus. And these amendments of constitution, ex-president is talking about, it should take place alongside with new elections or right after the elections. You know, we have to show priorities in our revolution. And so as for journalists, again, I have to say that journalism is a very important factor in our revolution, and it is important to support them because they are lack of space, you know, in the country. They can't earn their money just to show us this truth. So this technical support to journalists is very important. So what I missed?
No, I appreciate it. As I finish, I just want to thank you again for your courageous leadership. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member, Mr. Smith, others who have been helping us focus the world's attention. And as you approach these Freedom Day protests, as you talk about the need for grassroots democracy, and even as 400 activists have been sentenced to prison, including a 16-year-old suffering from epilepsy who was sentenced to 5 years in prison simply for participating in the protest. Please know that it is not just this subcommittee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, but that the United States Congress and the people of the United States stand with you and the people of Belarus in your rightful quest for democracy. And we're so honored by your presence today. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. That was thank you for your strong remarks and incorporating your family background. That was very meaningful. Representative Titus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for setting up this amazing meeting. I can't imagine having a more inspiring witness than we have this morning. Thank you for your courage and for being here. I would just ask you if you would maybe elaborate on the plan that you call the Liberation Plan that you came out with in February. Talk a little bit about maybe your deadlines, what you see as part of that plan. Will you be working with any NGOs or organizations like NDI, IRI to help you with that? And is part of that plan dealing with COVID? I know that Lukashenko has just pretty much denied COVID and said it's go to a spa and drink vodka and you'll be okay. But someone of your stature and your presence could have a lot of impact on addressing that issue as well.
COVID situation is rather, I'd say, interesting in Belarus because when the whole world was struggling with COVID, with the first wave of COVID, our regime told that there is no COVID in Belarus, and even if it is, so you can treat it with the tractors and vodka. And at that very moment, when regime didn't take care of Belarusian people in spring, Belarusians had to take care of themselves, but of themselves. They started to buy this usual masks for doctors and this special breathing equipment. They collected money to buy this equipment for hospitals. So at that moment, again, we had a provement that government doesn't take care about the nation. And now the situation is also very bad with COVID on the ground, but we know that real numbers are much higher than government say. And one doctor who dared tell the real numbers was immediately fired from the hospital, just for telling the truth. And as for our plan, there can't be deadlines here. Of course, we want new elections to happen on September. For this, we have to start dialogue this May. That's why people are beginning the second wave of protest and movement in Belarus on the ground. That's why this is a very crucial moment for all the international society, for all the countries and leaders and organizations to put maximum pressure on the regime to make him answer our calls for dialogue. So we have, if we can say so, spring is the beginning of protests. Till May, we have to organize this dialogue platform on the basis of OSCE and start to negotiate about new elections in September or October this year.
Thank you very much. You have quite a task ahead of you. Are you working with any NGOs on the ground there? Are there any formal organizations, or is it just kind of spontaneous protest?
It's very difficult for NGOs to survive in Belarus. Mm-hmm. They are pressed, they are under constant pressure. And, we can say that we have like legal NGOs in Belarus and illegal. I can't pronounce these words, but this is our reality. Uh-huh. And we are just trying to help, and international society is trying to help different kind of NGOs on the ground for them to transfer this help to people who are suffering, people who are in prison, people who that are fighting. So we have to look for new forms of helping these NGOs. It's very difficult to work in the country where there is no law, where all the organizations that are helping people are under constant pressure of the regime because they don't want this organization to help.
Yeah, they don't really want it to exist. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being here and for your courage. Just be careful there. Just be careful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Titus. Representative Schneider is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. And as others have said, I can't thank you enough for having this hearing. And Mrs. Sigonoskaya, I can't thank you enough for spending the time to share with us your story, but also can't thank you enough for the inspiration you provide to your country, to the world, for democracy, for courage and bravery and hope. I join with my colleagues, colleagues on this panel, who I believe are representative of the entire United States Congress, and by extension, the entire American people, in standing in solidarity with you, with the heroic women leading the way, and with the entire Belarusian people and the pro-democracy movement. Personally, my story has connections to Belarus. My maternal grandfather's family was from Brest-Litovsk in Belarus. They came here at the turn of the last century, but we can trace deep roots back there. I take personally extraordinary inspiration from the bravery and the defiance, the resiliency of the women of Belarus, that we talked about today, and of the Belarus people as a whole. I have 3 questions we can touch on, but trying to get into specifics. I'll lay them out, and then you can address them any way you want. But first, what can Congress do to best support you and the pro-democracy movement, to support your resolve, the resilience to stand strong throughout this crisis until we get to the end we all hope for? Towards that end, in more detail, what pressure can we apply to the regime? You mentioned sector-specific sanctions. What specific sectors do you have in mind, and are there specific entrepreneurs we should be focused on? And finally, what can Congress, the United States, and our allies do to, in your words, create a positive program for change for a new Belarus? And I think I may have lost you.
Yeah. Could we just pause for a moment and see if technically...
I lost the button. Sorry.
Yeah. Perhaps if you could just summarize again quickly, if that's possible. Representative Schneider, could you just...
I'm sorry, were you able to hear me, Ms. Sigonoskaya, or do I need to summarize?
Yeah. I just, thank you, I'm sorry. How to support Belarusian people, or Belarus at the moment, how to be with Belarusian people. So first of all, these 3 pillars. First of all is pressure on the regime. Sanction, putting political pressure, isolate regime of Lukashenko politically and economically and all this stuff. Secondly, it's support to civil society, media, workers, medics, any groups of people. And the third pillar is justice in our country. There is no law at the moment in Belarus. We have to look for justice in other countries. And many cases of investigation of crimes in Belarus have been started on the basis of universal jurisdiction in Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic. So you can support this, support 3 pillars, or do something else you can. And secondly, you can support UN accountability mechanism for investigating crimes in Belarus. And again, we from the USA, sectoral sanctions in such spheres as oil, gas, and potash fertilizer industries are very important. Just if you find any state organizations that are like wallets of Lukashenko, oligarchs that supporting this regime, supporting violence, and impose sanctions on them, it will be very, good, strong leverage on oppression for the regime. And as for future of Belarus, the only thing I want from the future of Belarus is that my children, new generation, feel safe on the ground, that they understand that person is the highest value for this country. That every person is responsible for building this new Belarus. And having paid such a huge price during this revolution for New Belarus, I'm sure that every Belarusians will do his or her best to stay united in the future and to do everything to come to democracy.
Thank you. That's a phenomenal, inspiring answer. And know that we are with you. Know that we are cheering for your country, for your people. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Muser is recognized for 5 minutes. Representative Muser.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for attending this hearing with us. Certainly some compelling testimony. Ms. Sigonoskaya, you wrote in the Washington Post op-ed last year that we will continue our boycott of the state apparatus. Many private businesses have stopped dealing with state-owned banks, or will do the same whenever possible. Business people should delay, refuse to pay, and refuse to buy products from state-owned factories. Can you describe how things have gone since making those statements, and has it been successful? Has it had some deteriorating factors? Maybe expand upon that a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, Miss.
So can you repeat the question?
When your comments in the Washington Post op-ed that you had written last year, where regarding boycotting of state-owned businesses and factories, can you please expand upon how that, what that was met with? Heavy resistance, problems for you personally? Has it met with any success?
Many people say, not in Belarus, just in Europe, that sanctions can make people suffer on the ground because they will have lose their job or something. But people are already suffering. It's not my demand put on sanctions on state organizations. It's people's demand who are working in these organizations, and they. They are suffering at the moment. They are being fired. They are putting on pressure from the regime. They are, humiliated on the factories in different ways. They get small salaries and have a lot to do on the factories, but still they need this sanction because people understand that this economical pressure will ruin this regime. When regime doesn't have money to pay to the right police will refuse to save this regime. It's like it's like a circle. Factories doesn't pay regime doesn't pay right police, and regime doesn't have support, because the only support at the moment regime has it's violence executed by right police. So people are ready to suffer because of lack of salaries, but they want this regime, they want to change this regime so much that they want the sanctions most of all.
Okay. And so the 9 Belarusian officials and human rights and 4 entities related to human rights abuses that were sanctioned several months ago, Has that been effective, and should that be expanded in your view? Based upon what you stated, we should be engaged in more heavier sanctions of more individuals as well as entities that are part of this oppression.
Of course, I have to say that we are grateful for all the sanction list you have already imposed, but we see that the number of people is not enough, because this very narrow circle of people sanctions, they know how to avoid these sanctions. You know, they don't have assets in your banks already. They know how to avoid this. But those people, the judges, security forces officers, education and sport officials that support regime, they also have to be put on sanctions list, because next time, next officer, next judge will think twice before making new crime against a person or against demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators. Threaten of these sanctions is sometimes even more useful than than any other way of pressure on these people. For sure, sanction list has to be widened.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and just a couple of closing remarks of thanks. Ms. Sigonoskaya, this was an enormously moving hearing, an unusual hearing in that respect, and your participation and taking the time to talk with us in Congress is so important. And my colleagues, who I want to thank all of them. It's an abnormally busy day today for many reasons, and the participation was extraordinary, this subcommittee hearing. I would say this, that Ms. Sigonoskaya, you began the hearing with your remarks wishing us a happy St. Patrick's Day. And I want to think about the words of a very famous Irish poet, Seamus Heaney. And he remarked at one point, and it's a remark that's used quite often by our president, President Biden, when he said, they were talking about the period of troubles in Ireland that was so severe, he said that if we can winter this one out, we can summer anywhere. And I think winter has descended in terms of democracy right on Belarus. And the world knows that, and the US knows that. And we are going to weather this winter together, a winter of authoritarian rule, of violence, of intimidation. And we're going to work together with you, hopefully joining together as a diaspora as well as government officials. As you go forward with your IT platform strategy of victory, we'll be looking and perhaps helping to deal with those issues as you go forward. But I want to tell you, we will continue. The US will fully implement the powers that it can implement for democracy in Belarus. We will work on a continuing basis to stop the violence there, to push for the release of political prisoners there, and to make sure that there's a genuine dialogue between the people of Belarus and forging ahead to a legitimate government where people can be represented. And just in your last few remarks, I think you summed up the goals of all of us in a free world when you just said, what we want most is to pass a better world and a better country to our children. And importantly, you said, every person has a responsibility. So I want to assure you that we view our responsibility as standing up for Belarus, for democracy, and you continue to inspire us every day. And the work and the effort that you've done, joined by so many courageous individuals and the hallmark of them probably in this effort more than many others, of women being involved, is so important. So thank you so much for being here. We will continue to work with you to make sure that the people of Belarus can get through this winter. And then when that happens, we can all celebrate democracy all the time in the summer. So thank you so much. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.